Hello, everyone joining us. I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we will get started here. Make sure we allow everybody time to get logged in today. For those of you who have joined, we're excited you're here, and we are happy to announce that NHA is going to be kicking off a new monthly webinar series, and this is the first episode or webinar in that series. So hopefully you enjoy today and you will come back each month for some exciting topics to learn more about things that are happening and relevant not only to NHA, but to the healthcare, education, and workforce setting. I'm still seeing participants being added. So again, we'll give it just another quick minute and then we will get started. As everyone is logging in, just please make sure you're on mute. I do believe we have the settings to where everyone is muted, but just in case, make sure you're on mute. And during this specific webinar today, it's going to be more of an informational session, but please feel free to add questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, because we'll be able to pull those and follow up with you after the webinar is over, because we want to make sure we get you all the information that you need on this topic. All right. Well, due to time, we are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody today to the launch of NHA's new monthly webinar series. This is the first month and topic of that series. And the topic today is Finding Opportunity, the New Administration, Legislation, and You. And our goal today is that we can help raise awareness about recent and current pieces of legislation that are impacting the healthcare, education, and clinical space. So hopefully there will be some good information to share today. Just again, if you're just joining us, I believe we have the settings to where everyone is on mute, but if not, please make sure you are on mute. And we will not have any opportunity to do live Q&A with this particular topic today, but please feel free to add your questions either in the chat or in the question and answer section of Zoom. We'll be pulling those out and we can certainly follow up with your questions after the presentation is over. We have a moderator in the background as well, so if there is something urgent or comes up, you may hear them jump in to give some direction if we need it. So again, thanks so much for joining us today. I am happy to be the first presenter of our monthly webinar series. So in case you don't know, my name is Jessica Langley-Loep. I'm the Executive Director of Education and Advocacy for the National Health Career Association, and I've been with the organization about 8 years. And I have over 20 years experience in both clinical education and health sciences education. And I have been working to lead the NHA team in our regulatory and advocacy efforts over the past years. So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I'm excited to be able to bring you some of this information today that can hopefully be insightful and helpful as everyone continues to move forward in figuring out how to deliver the best quality education and patient care during this pandemic. I'm also excited to be joined today with a partner of NHA, Lobbyit, who is a national lobbying firm out of DC. And we have the Vice President of Lobbyit here today, Jason Ortega. I'm going to let him share a little bit about his background, and he's going to be able to provide some additional information for our audience today as well. Thanks, Jason.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. Happy to be here. As Jessica said, and you can see on the screen, I'm Jason Ortega. I'm Vice President here at Lobbyit. I am part of the lobbying team for NHA based here in Washington, D.C. Lobbyit is a boutique firm that really specializes in working with national and international associations, providing advocacy both on the Hill and with the administration. My background is I've been with the firm for a little over 6 years now. It's kind of hard to believe. My training and background is as a lawyer and an MBA, but left those fairly quickly after graduation and decided to pursue politics, which was a bit more exciting. And as the last several years have shown, definitely is quite exciting and a bit of a roller coaster. So it's been great to be here in Washington, be able to engage on these very important issues for all of our various clients, but most especially for NHA.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. Glad you could be here. Okay, now due to just the nature of the information that we're going to be covering today, we do want to put a disclaimer out there that the information in this presentation should not be relied upon as legal or legislative advice. It's intended to help our audience understand high-level details about recent legislation that is fluid and highly dependent upon your individual's facts and circumstances. The educational institution or organization that you work in will deal with these current legislative efforts all differently. You must not rely on anything contained in this presentation, and you must seek your own qualified legal or legislative advice when making decisions about these topics that we're going to be discussing. So just a little bit of standard things that we have to go through there. We'll move into today's agenda and discussion topics. So really three main areas that we want to discuss today. And we're going to do our best to share some high-level information regarding the many pieces of federal legislation that have been circling around in DC that have impacted or possibly impacting your healthcare educational programs or your healthcare organizations. We also hope that we're able to provide some level of insights into potential funding opportunities that may exist within your organizations coming from these specific pieces of legislation, and also how you might be able to collaborate with other industry leaders and fellow stakeholders to benefit the most from these efforts. So, for example, working in collaboration with an employer or workforce development board to capitalize on some of the opportunities that the legislation puts forth. So that's the three areas we're going to cover today. So you might be asking yourself, is my program or organization impacted by any of these current or recent pieces of legislation that have passed or are being discussed right now in DC currently? And as you can see from this slide, the pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about today do have an impact or influence these three core areas. So the first one being secondary education, which is traditionally K-12, but for our audience, some of you may be involved in a career and technical education program, so it certainly applies to you as well. We then have the post-secondary education market that has also been a key priority for past COVID relief reconciliation bills, with resources and funding dedicated to an array of post-secondary institutions, colleges and universities, ranging from community colleges to nonprofit, for-profit, along with non-degreed adult ed certificate-based programs with a heavy emphasis on skills-based training. Also, with the economy being so heavily impacted by the pandemic, we are seeing a lot of workforce and healthcare organizations being top of mind with some of these pieces of legislation as well. And as you can see here, apprenticeships is a prime example of that. And we'll speak a little bit more in depth about that later on in the presentation. So in preparation for this webinar, many of you may have received a survey a couple of weeks ago from NHA. And if you participated, we appreciate it. But we sent out this survey to thousands of our customers looking to really gauge what level of awareness and knowledge that our stakeholders had on the topic of recent and current legislation and the funding opportunities that could be found within them. And as you can see, this statistic here, 65% of the respondents of that survey stated they were unsure if themselves, their program, or their organization qualified or was able to have access to any of that federal funding that came from those pieces of legislation. So the goal was that was the key driver for this session today, is really to just help inform. We understand and want you guys to know that NHA is not a regulatory expert. It's not a part of the business that we really focus on. However, we do have a dedicated team that works very closely with, for example, our partners in different areas of government relations and advocacy. And we really want to just be able to provide insightful information and direct you to the appropriate resources to help you understand how you or your organization might be impacted in this particular space. So that was really the key driver of providing this information for you all today. Now, it's funny because anytime someone new enters into either the healthcare education or the healthcare space, many of you, if you're practitioners, we live by abbreviations and acronyms. Well, unfortunately, it's no different in the regulatory space. As you can see, it's a little bit of alphabet soup here. Many of you may have read or seen some of these titles or abbreviations listed in various headlines or blogs or news articles that you have read. The good news is we're going to provide you a chart explaining and outlining what each of these titles stand for. Most of them are associated with last year's or 2020's COVID relief packages, but there are a few that we're going to discuss in more detail today, such as the American Recovery Plan, which was the most recent piece of legislation enacted in March of this year. Also, the WIOA and Higher Education Reauthorization Acts of both of those two pieces. So we'll go a little bit more in depth on that. And Jason, I might have you jump in if you're prepared. Can you talk just a little bit here about the difference between like a legislative act such as the American Rescue Plan versus a reauthorization that would happen with WIOA or HEA, just so they kind of have an understanding of the difference between the two?
Sure. So the most pieces of legislation that pass nowadays, like the ARP Act, is a brand new piece of legislation. Now, that bill may be changing existing funding levels, criteria within existing government programs, or creating whole new programs altogether and affecting policy. What's different from that and from a program like from reauthorization bills like HEA and WIOA is that these are reauthorizing pre-existing programs that have technically kind of expired in legislative terms, but they continue to fund them, so they continue to exist, but they have to operate under older rules. So that actually applies to WIOA, HEA, and really to the apprenticeship program as well, which we'll touch on, which has, both of those are operating under older rules. HEA, of course, has a fairly lengthy piece of legislation that the higher education system is operating under from the last reauthorization. Similarly with WIOA, Apprenticeship Act actually would be really expanding the legislative language that governs the National Apprenticeship Registered Apprenticeship Program, because that was actually established several decades ago and does not have a lot of legislative language providing guidance, which is why there's a lot of urgency surrounding that. But all of the reauthorization bills are technically overdue at this point, and there's a lot of urgency surrounding trying to get a bipartisan agreement on them.
Great, and I think that's the key piece is each of the different sides of the legislation introduce their own bills in reauthorization, and they still have to come to that agreement in order to enact that, correct?
Correct. These are things that we'll touch on this a little bit later as to the difference between regular order and reconciliation. But these bills are ones, unlike ARP, with HEA and WIOA, they really do need to have bipartisan agreement because they're not going to be able to pass it with just a party vote, a single party vote, as given the current makeup of the Senate.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so moving into kind of at least providing you a little bit of a summary over that legislative naming that we just went through. And as we kind of hit on these a little bit already, but you can kind of see kind of in order of dates, right? Higher Education Act is currently in process, but is up for reauthorization this year. Part of that is the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the previous one that most people recognize as No Child Left Behind, similar to that, and that was enacted in December 2015. But people often refer to ESSA when they're talking about, funding current educational programs. WIO, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. The last time it was reauthorized, it looks like it was 2014 and is up again for reauthorization, as Jason mentioned, this year. And then, so as a result of the CARES Act, if you skip down a little bit, from March of 2020 was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act. They also then implemented an additional appropriation, so the CRRSA, in December. What those did is they actually created the Emergency Stabilization Fund, which then funded, if you go back up a little bit, the HEER, the GEER, and the ESSER. So lots of letters there, but in summary, the Higher Education Emergency Relief, Governor's Emergency Education Relief, and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. So those three are the three primary funding elements that came out of the CARES Act that have an impact in education. And then, as we mentioned previously, the most recent one in March was the American Rescue Plan. And we will talk more in depth about that one. So because it is a little bit historical at this point last year, because there's been so much activity because of the pandemic, we're just going to give a quick high level look at the funding specifics that happened last year related to the pandemic. And then you can also see the ARP Act from this year on this chart recognized on the right-hand side there. So as of March of this year, there have been 3 federal stimulus packages that have supported education, and that's what's listed here at the top. And as you can see from the CARES Act and the CRRSA Act, the Education Stabilization Fund was developed, and then there are those 3 large buckets below that support education. So the Elementary and Secondary School Relief Fund allocated to state education agencies. Gave them the funding, who then awarded around 90% of those funds to local education agencies, which really just means your school districts. The Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, that was given directly to governors, and so they had the discretion to address the highest priority needs across K-12 and public higher education institutions within their states. And then we had the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which was more solely focused on post-secondary or higher education institutions. So moving on to the American Rescue Plan. So we want to spend a little bit more time discussing this since that is the current piece of legislation that is in play. It was passed on March 10th. It is a $1.9 trillion stimulus package that is hoping to provide critical funding for public schools, create millions of jobs, also have an impact on reducing child poverty, making healthcare more affordable, and really kind of boosting us into economic recovery based on the slump that we've been in due to the pandemic. And as you can see, this law gives approximately $125 billion to K-12 and $40 billion to higher education. So you may be asking yourself, that is a lot of money. And surely because of that amount, your school or your organization is most likely receiving some of these funds, and you're not sure where or how those funds are being used or spent. Now, of course, I wish I could help answer that question specific to your organization, but we can share with you a little bit about generally how these funds have been used. So in K-12, that again includes CTE programs, the funds are typically allocated to states and districts based on the share of funding they receive through their Title I program, which is the ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act. And then 90% of the higher education funds are flowing to public and private nonprofit institutions, which most of those being dedicated to emergency student aid. So maybe in the sense of financial aid or things like that. Of the nearly 170 billion in dedicated public education funding, that money is often used to have smaller class sizes. Many of us saw that with our own children. They added classrooms or had remote class learning options, hiring more people so that they could social distance, including custodians to keep schools cleaner, nurses and counselors to just help with the impact that the pandemic brought with remote learning and social distancing, and then also transportation services as well. It's also been seen to support items to address student trauma and learning loss during the time of the pandemic as well. 40 billion also went to public institutions of higher education to assist in implementation. Again, safety protocols might have been a little bit different than our K-12 setting, but they had a huge transition to make in terms of distance learning and online learning in the post-secondary space. And then also, as we mentioned, emergency financial assistance for students. They also saw an uptick and a usage of funds for supporting mental health and social and emotional learning at colleges and universities across the country. Another big area that we saw funding go to, around $7 billion, was to purchase technology in schools. So both devices, Wi-Fi connectivity to help students stay connected during this time of heightened distance learning. And I think Jason's going to step in and speak a little bit here about, based on that spending and the areas that it went to, what were some of the educational benefits that we saw in both secondary and post-secondary spaces.
Yeah, so as you can see on the chart there, the educational benefits from this bill are pretty varied. And in many ways, this bill is similar to some of the CARES Act and the supplemental funding that we saw last year, which was really designed to try to blunt the impact of the pandemic, try to limit layoffs, ensure that there were sufficient mental health support systems in place, aid in the transition to more heavily technologically based classrooms, which a lot of schools, both in the higher ed and the post-secondary and the K through 12 sectors, did not have a lot of the technology, the hotspots, et cetera, that were necessary to get students in that direction. And then to also try and help in some sectors like the HBCUs or TCUs, and some of these, and in some of the lesser funded school districts around the country, to help them make sure that they were able to kind of survive and exist, beyond the pandemic and as students are getting back to school. But also part of this bill that is a little bit unique in comparison to the bills that we saw passed last year is that there are some of these impacts that will be around for a little bit longer. Right. So there was a mention earlier as to cutting childhood poverty through payments that are going to go throughout the rest of the year. There are incentives for employers to help pay off student loans, right, which is a benefit for in the education sector, and that's going to extend for another 5 years, and that's a tax type of provision. So there is not a direct immediate outlay from the federal government, but certainly a cost when it comes to revenue. So a lot of these things in ARP, even when some of the targets for this bill were to try to blunt the impact, do have a bit of a longer tail when it comes to long-term impact in the economy, on students, on education, beyond just the short term. And I think that reflects just the overall transitionary nature of ARP, which is kind of taking us from, okay, we need to blunt the impact of the pandemic, but also we need to start jump starting the economy again, making sure that as students get back, they're ideally in a better place. Schools are ideally in a better place, if possible, than they were before the pandemic. And as the money starts flowing out, and because we have not seen all of this money, they're still dispersing money from the supplemental bill, which passed at the end of last year. There, some of the money from, the bulk of the money here has not rolled out to state and local still from ARP, which, a lot of this money is in those buckets. So we're going to see this impact continue even as we start talking about additional spending.
Great. Thanks for that. One piece of ARP that is particularly important in the healthcare education space was what we speak to in higher education is the 90-10 rule. And I know, Jason, we mentioned previously that some of these pieces of legislation like ARP could have been done through the way a practice in Washington called reconciliation. Can you talk a little bit about, was the CARES Act one of those, or was the American Rescue Plan an example of that? And how does that work to kind of streamline the passing of a piece of legislation in DC versus getting or gaining bipartisan support? And then we can talk a little bit about how the 90-10 rule is changing as a result of the American Rescue Plan.
Yes, so something you may have been hearing a lot more this year, a couple of words are budget reconciliation. Another one would be the filibuster. These are words that became a lot more relevant after the result in Georgia, which resulted in a 50-50 tie in the Senate, still giving control because of the tiebreaker vote from the vice president to the Democrats across all three levers of power here in Washington. And to start with the filibuster, that's a legislative procedure in the Senate that allows a senator from blocking a bill getting a vote on the floor. And the only way to overcome the filibuster is with a 60 vote uh, 60 a 60 vote tally, I guess is the way to say that. And so in order for anything to move, essentially you need 60 votes. And what ends up happening with budget reconciliation is that a couple of decades ago, they decided, okay, a way to get around this and to do so more, to be able to make sure that the government is funded, that was part of the underlying rationale for this, is to allow budgetary bills, bills that have a direct and bills with provisions that have a direct and targeted impact on the federal budget, to be able to pass those with a simple majority. So they're immune to the filibuster. They can pass with just a 51 vote margin. And that is how the American Rescue Plan was passed. We have not seen a reconciliation used for a couple of years because last year the stimulus bills were passed with a bipartisan vote. the last major piece of legislation which we saw pass with via reconciliation before the ARP was the tax plan that passed under President Trump, and before that it was Obamacare that passed obviously under Obama. So it really is very rare because of the work that it takes to actually get it through. You have to keep everyone in line, and there's a lot of procedures that have to fall into place in order for you to successfully get a bill to the president's desk via reconciliation. But that is what ended up happening back in March, and what we may end up seeing at least one more time over the next year and a half.
Perfect. And so with that, one of the items that was included in ARP was the 90-10 rule that really has an impact, a larger impact, I guess, on for-profit educational organizations receiving Title IV or federal funding. Under the current law, schools cannot receive more than 90% of their tuition dollars from a federal source. So there is a 90-10 loophole in which most schools are working within, where military and veterans education benefits are not being included against or counted against the cap. So you're talking about like GI Bill funding, MyCAA, which is military spouse funding, things like that. So for example, the military benefit counts towards the 10% versus the 90%. And another opposite example of that is WIOA funding is counted in the 90% bucket. So what the American Rescue Plan does is it's looking to try and close the 90-10 loophole and suspends taxation of student loan discharges. So part of the plan put forth that they had to go through a negotiated rulemaking process that has to happen before 2023, in where the GI educational benefits will now be deemed federal education aid for the purposes of the 90-10 rule. So now they'll be part of the 90 versus the 10, which bars for-profit colleges from receiving more than the 90% of their revenue from federal government resources. And it removes financial incentives that enabled the potential predatory recruiting of student veterans by potentially some of those institutions, not all of them, of course. Additionally, the law suspends the taxation of federal student loan discharges until 2026. So that's ensuring that via the statute that the broad-based debt forgiveness or any loan discharged through existing processes like income-based repayment plans or a successful borrower defense claim doesn't come with additional tax bills that borrowers can't afford. So really supporting students, putting additional measures and kind of tightening that window in the post-secondary space to ensure that not all of those funds are being used for or being counted in the federal funding bucket. So something that I know colleges and universities will definitely be watching as this progresses over the next couple of years. So we have also seen the American Rescue Plan have an impact on our healthcare workforce. So for those of you who are clinicians or working in healthcare organizations as a frontline healthcare worker, maybe you're certified by NHA in one of the areas that we support. So we wanted to make sure we talked a little bit and gave you some awareness around how that's impacting that particular sector. So it is allowing insurance coverage to be expanded. And this is the first time that's enacted since the Affordable Care Act. So we know the Affordable Care Act was really raising the percentage of people who needed to be insured, and ARP is supporting that and actually expanding. $75 billion has been used for vaccine efforts and COVID-19 testing, contract tracing, and things like that. $3 billion to state block grants for community mental health services and substance abuse prevention. We've seen a rise in this across the country during the pandemic, probably due to people having to see a dramatic change in their lives from not being able to socially engage or interact, looking at differences in their work environment along with their learning environment, and it has had a very large impact on the mental health of the United States population. We are seeing increased funding for community health centers. These are traditionally centers that may be found in more rural areas closer to home. Obviously, with the limited availability of people being able to travel, they've seen an overarching impact in their ability to care for and service members of their community. Also, increased veteran affairs care funding, and then supporting of skilled nursing facilities in their response to COVID-19, along with state Medicaid offices to support training of home health workers. Because again, many of them could not have outside institutions or family members come in to support those that were really bound to skilled nursing centers during the pandemic. So moving on, and we just wanted to throw this in here, as Jason mentioned, that not all the funding has actually been released. And this is the most recent announcement that came about funds being available through the American Rescue Plan. They just released the HERF-3 funds that are now the most recent round of funding for higher education institutions. And so we have a couple of buckets here to really talk about, like, how does this impact proprietary institutions, public and nonprofit, and then even students now that this particular round of funding is available. Like similar rounds of HERF funding that was allocated to proprietary institutions, they can only be used to provide financial aid grants to students. And that can include students that are enrolled in distance education. Emergency financial aid grants may also be used for students for any component of their cost of attendance or for emergency costs that arise due to coronavirus, such as tuition, food, housing, healthcare, and childcare. So that's really important. If a proprietary institution had completed their application before, they are not required to submit a new application to receive funding. And it looks like institutions must submit certification forms by August 11th in order to not risk losing any of the recent allocations that will be coming out. Again, there's a lot more details behind this. We just wanted to give you kind of a high-level overview. So there's certainly additional resources that we could provide to you, talking in more depth about how this round of funding could be given out and what the stipulations are. Now, for public and nonprofit, again, funds are to be provided and used for financial aid grants to students. They can also use a portion of that to be used on expenses associated with coronavirus, again, loss of revenue, student support activities, and such. If an institution doesn't use all of its institutional or financial aid grants to students, it must use some of the funds to implement evidence-based practices to help monitor the impacts and suppress the effects of coronavirus in accordance with public health guidance. So again, safety protocols, social distancing, cleaning, things like that. Students are also directly eligible to receive HERF funding allocations. And again, we can provide additional information. Most of those go directly to the students via the schools, but we can provide additional information on that as well. So another big question that we know everybody is asking is how and when do these funds have to be spent? We've listed a number of them here. So the CARES Act, ARP, emergency stimulus response funds must be obligated by September 2022. You can see here that some of the funds may be applied to purchases made prior to the actual award of the funding, but since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, so it has to be within that time frame. It has to be for an initiative or a project that happened due to COVID, but it does not, as long as they get that in, those funds may not have to be spent. They just have to be obligated by September of this year. ARP funds, so the most recent rounds of funding, must be used by December 31st of 2024. So that kind of goes to show and support a little bit more of what Jason was saying as to where this has a little bit more of a long-term effect, and will last a little bit longer than some of the deadlines that came from CARES and CRRSA back in 2020. A couple of things to note: state and local governments cannot use the funds towards pensions or to offset revenue resulting from a tax cut that was enacted in March. States received access to 2/3 as of March to their ARP allocation. And at that point, it was 81 billion. The remaining 41 billion will become available after state plans are approved by the department. So the states have to submit those. They must submit those plans by June 7th of this year. And then the department will review and begin approving applications and disbursements once those plans are received and reviewed as quickly as possible. So couple of dates there to remember that might be important to you and your institution. Another thing that we want to make sure we focus on is just giving you all a few ideas on how to maximize some of the stimulus funding if you are getting a portion of that through your schools that may be passed down to your programs or even to your organizations in the healthcare space. And these have been collected just from us talking with clients that we engage with on both the educational and the clinical side of things. So one of them being focusing on student achievement and outcomes. If there are projects or research studies or activities or initiatives that fall into this category, we are seeing a lot of promising approvals of funding going towards those types of projects. Maybe think about ways that you can pay for things now that are sustainable resources and tools for multiple years down the road. To help assess and accelerate student growth. Look at investing in professional learning for teachers, administrators. That can also be seen similarly in the clinical space at training or upskilling current employees, especially frontline healthcare workers that have been a key focus and an area of interest, obviously during the pandemic, for being the first point of contact and providing a very high level of care for individuals during the pandemic. And then also maybe evaluate, are there new programs that can be started to meet not only the current market needs, but also near term or future market needs. So is there, as we mentioned in the American Rescue Plan, that there was a focus on home health aid workers. That's something that as a school, knowing that that's a market or industry need, that could be an area that you might be considering as a new program within your particular organization. So just a couple of examples there of how organizations, states, school districts have looked at maximizing their stimulus funding. All right, we are going to move along because I know we looks like we have about 15 minutes left, but we did want to give you some high-level insights as to other pieces of legislation that are currently being discussed and debated in DC right now, many of them impacting you all in the healthcare education and healthcare workforce space. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk a little bit about these and kind of group them together. National Apprenticeship Act, of course, we mentioned WIOA and HEA reauthorization to kind of let you know the biggest impact that you might see from this.
Great, yes. So the Apprenticeship Act, as I mentioned earlier, is really based on language that is a bit outdated. There are a lot of improvements that both individuals who participate regularly in the registered apprenticeship program, lawmakers, other stakeholders, there's a lot of changes that they want to see made. And as you can tell here, we do not have as many apprentices as we would like. There has been previous goals of hitting 1 million or more a year, which we are quite far from. And the program really needs a lot of improvement in order to reach that point and to expand access to additional professions, additional career pathways, additional entities that can participate in the program. So to that end, the House last session in the last 2 year block of Congress, 2019 and 2020, they actually passed a apprenticeship act. However, it was partisan. It did not garner a lot of Republican support, and the Senate had Republican control at the time, so it didn't really go anywhere. Now we have the Apprenticeship Act that passed once again earlier this year, coming out of the House. But this time the Senate is working in a bipartisan manner, trying to reach an agreement. And this is something that we as NHA have submitted kind of some comments and recommendations. The Department of Labor is relaunching their apprenticeship advisory committee, which advises the secretary on improvements that he can make within his current authorities over the program. So there's a lot of activity right now surrounding this bill and trying to see if not only the administration can make improvements with the authority they already have and the funding that they already have, but then in an ideal world, really getting legislation through, because the major changes, the major funding that can roll out really needs to be accomplished through legislation. So that's something that we're monitoring fairly closely right now. It is high on the priority list for Senate Help Committee, which is the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate that has a jurisdiction over this, and as the name kind of implies, over a lot of different things, but also over apprenticeship. And they've launched that. It's in negotiations. They're working behind the scenes, trying to reach a deal.
It is
And so go ahead.
it is a fairly impactful bill. I think I read $3.5 billion over 5 years, which is huge, to help expand and grow those apprenticeship programs.
Yes, it would. If passed, that bill would certainly qualify as a quantum leap forward for the apprenticeship program. And really, it incorporates already, it has a lot of bipartisan provisions that have been recommended in other pieces of legislation. So, as you saw on the initial list, and I think we have a slide for the Relaunching America's Workforce, the Gateway to Careers Act. Both of these bills have elements that have made it into the National Apprenticeship Act, and that the Senate side is considering as to which, whether to put additional pieces of this, whether to build out on it or not. So both of these bills have some similar goals and do things, but just do things slightly differently. So they both roll out funding to help provide for the support services that a apprentice needs, and provide funding for entities to cooperate with each other in order to establish or operate an apprenticeship program. So there's a lot of hurdles right now for individuals to become an apprentice because of the cost involved with just simply living and your expenses, and oftentimes the apprenticeship program may not provide sufficient funding, and may serve as a hurdle. So these bills try to address that. And then there are hurdles for organizations that want to establish a registered apprenticeship program, because of the time and the cost and the partners that you need to come in contact with. One of the organizations I work with, they have the first framework in apprenticeship that they've had for their industry, but it took over 3 years. And it still, it takes some time. So these bills try to alleviate both of those issues and provide funding. And we're happy to see some of these elements in the National Apprenticeship Act, which, as I said before, has kind of absorbed some of the principles from other bills, particularly bills that are bipartisan, in an attempt to garner additional support.
Great. And I know we're starting to hear a lot more information and become more engaged with our stakeholders. Many of you may be on the call with apprenticeship programs. They may be more informal in nature and not part of a registered apprenticeship programs, meaning that they went through the steps to get approved by the Department of Labor, but um, they're taking on the same earn and learn model and looking to collaborate within their communities. You have a school, an employer, working together to provide the relevant curriculum, giving them the on-the-job training that they need, and then ending with that industry recognized credential. And so obviously NHA plays a part in that, and we've really worked at connecting our educators and employers together to try and set up a lot of those programs. We have a couple of case studies if anybody is interested in how that process kind of worked out and how the collaboration came about and the results of pairing a educational program or workforce development program with employers and certification organizations. If you also have questions about maybe how to start an apprenticeship program, how you can get funding or what type of funding is available, I encourage you to look to your state or regional apprenticeship offices. They're located in most states. You can also potentially reach out to your local or community workforce board. And then healthcare apprenticeships is actually gaining a lot of strength and acceptance. And there is an organization out there, they act kind of as a consultant and an advocate. They do a lot of work in DC as well. And it's called HCAPS, which is the Healthcare Career Advancement Program. And so it's hcapinc.org. They would be happy to, share information. They have a lot of great resources on their website too about just how to start and what are the components of a successful healthcare apprenticeship program, because that's what they focus on. They even have, as you mentioned, some core curriculum already and already outlined for specific healthcare programs. So a lot of great resources out there if this is an area that you're thinking about, which is becoming more popular.
For sure. And that bill also incorporates funding and additional framework for youth apprenticeships, reentry apprenticeship programs, and pre apprenticeship programs, which are all kind of important components of bolstering the number of apprentices in the country. A
Great.
couple of others, which we've already kind of briefly touched on, are the reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act and WIOA. Both of these, of course, would have a significant impact on healthcare careers. And right now, the WIOA process has already started in the House. They've held one, and I believe this week they're holding a second hearing out of three scheduled hearings to discuss the reauthorization of WIOA, what type of proposals should be included, where there might be bipartisan support. This program, of course, is very important. It provides a significant chunk of the funding for training, individuals throughout the country, and for in helping, particularly job seekers who are trying to enter the workforce. And I think that this one is a bit overdue in having some refresh, particularly in light of where the greatest needs are today after not only the last year and a half or so, but even coming into COVID, there were changes that needed to be made, and legislators acknowledged that, and they've already started that discussion. And I think, the reason you're seeing the Apprenticeship Act and WIOA kind of jump ahead of Higher Education Act, which realistically is in potentially more dire need of reauthorization than some of these other programs might be, given the sheer volume of dollars and students that are in adult learners that are impacted. It's because you're seeing an emphasis on just trying to find ways to get folks into the workforce without going through a long 4-year process, graduate school process, and putting an emphasis on the fact that many individuals don't actually need to go through that to have a highly successful and rewarding, personally and financially rewarding careers. So we're seeing a push towards trying to put more funding towards apprenticeships and WIOA funding as well out into the country in order to get people back to work faster and ideally into a career path that can be more long term than potentially many of the jobs that individuals lost as a result of COVID. So there's a sense of urgency around that. With higher education, there's a lot of changes that need to be made. There's a student loan crisis in the country. There's a lot of issues surrounding that. How are students educated across the country and advised into which career path they take? How well do they know about the loan obligations that they're taking? And so that is all on deck at some point. But right now, those conversations really have not even started, which is we're in a bit of a surprising place, because AHEA really was at the front of the line if we were talking about this in like middle of 2019. But today now it's kind of on the back burner.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that many on the call are engaged in a lot of those conversations. I know I have at least one email or conversation a day around how can we start to offer these short-term skills-based trainings as being the focus of the educational offerings in a more non-traditional way than we're typically seeing, right, with associate, bachelor's, master's degrees. So I am going to skip ahead and finish up here a little bit because I know one piece that we wanted to touch on was just the ability to focus on collaboration during all of this, and that successes are really being seen when organizations work together to look at accessing and setting up programs with this aid and funding that is coming from these pieces of federal legislation. I want to give just some statistics here that there's roughly $2 trillion spent annually on education and training, which to Jason's point, that again, right there is really why I think I feel like, and even those that are lobbying in DC are seeing that, work-based training, skills-based training bubbling to the top. Due to the pandemic and the impacts that they've had on workforce, a third of individuals in the workforce believe that they'll need additional education or skills-based training to find comparable employment if they lost their job during the pandemic or if they lose their job as a result of the pandemic. And of those, 35% are planning to change careers if they find themselves in that position. So they're actively looking at resources to help them learn a new skill or trade. I think it's also really important to think about having key partners, like we mentioned with the apprenticeships between education and industry. We're always focusing on how do we do that? How do we run and set up successful advisory boards? How do we collaborate on curriculum to ensure that the schools are producing the types of entry-level employees that the workforce is wanting and needing? We're constantly having discussions about dual credit so that we're narrowing the gap for individuals to go to work and then to also access higher levels of degrees. Another thing you mentioned was career pathways and skills-based training, which we said is starting to really get funneled not only into apprenticeships, but taking bits and pieces out of the Gateways to Careers Act and relaunching America's Workforce, which both of those are predominantly focused in those two areas of skills pathway or career pathways and skills-based training. So you can kind of see that all the lines are connected here with the organizations that we identify with your organizations. And we just really want to hope that this information was helpful for you today to be able to ask the right questions, start the conversation maybe with some of these other groups to understand a little bit more about what's happening and what's possible in your space to capitalize on the resources and funding that is coming out of DC. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining today. I hope that you received some valuable information. We definitely want to help you answer any questions that you have, because we just, the nature of the information, didn't want to go down any particular lanes today with Q&A from our participants, but we certainly value your comments and your questions. So again, feel free to put them in the chat box, the Q&A feature in Zoom, or of course, I get many of them from you guys every day. So continue to shoot me an email if you have questions. My contact information is there as well. And we'll look to see how we can provide you the necessary resources or connect you to the right people to help you all be the best that you can in your particular areas. So whether that be in educating the future workforce, future healthcare workforce, or being a healthcare employer, providing the best patient care to our communities and our population. So thanks again. We appreciate you all today. Have a great one. And don't forget to join us next month. Look for those announcements and emails for the next session of our monthly webinar series hosted by NHA. We'll see you all later.